Hello! Today I'm here to continue with my books that ... series, and today's episode is going to be about the books that have opened my eyes to certain issues that perhaps I wasn't aware of before I read them. I was going to say that these are books that have changed my opinion, but actually I don't think that's accurate. I don't think that a book has the ability to change your opinion necessarily, but books can certainly open your eyes to things that you weren't aware of. Unsurprisingly, the majority of these are non-fiction, and I was kind of expecting that when I went to my bookshelves with this video in mind. But there is one fiction, and I will start with that one. That is In One Person by John Irving. I'm kind of surprised to see this on here because I don't class this as a standout book. It was a good read, and I enjoyed it. And I actually went to see John Irving speak, not about this book, but about his latest release while I was reading this, so that was quite a fun experience. And I think it kind of made this book much more for me. It's set just before the 80s, and it's a time when being experimental with sexuality was kind of very underworld. It wasn't something that people openly spoke about, and it was something that was very much taboo and people kept to themselves. And that's very much what John Irving explores in this through the narration of his young character William, who is starting to experience sexual feelings that he doesn't quite understand. It doesn't look specifically at homosexuality because William does experience sexual feelings for quite a lot of different characters. It is very much a sexual exploration for him. He fancies males, he fancies females, he fancies older women, he fancies transgender people. He's just exploring this world where he's delving into his sexuality. But the reason that this book opened my eyes because we follow William through the AIDS epidemic when he loses a lot of his friends, and it's quite unflinching in its portrayal of the experience of living in that time. And although obviously everyone knows about the AIDS epidemic and the fact that people are still feeling the repercussions of that today, but I had never really read anything that was based in that time before, and it was so interesting but also heartbreaking to read about that, and it's something that I've gone on to buy other books about, because I think it's a time that does need to be spoken about, and it's something very important that happened to an already isolated community and isolated them further. And I think it is something that's crucial to talk about, and I think John Irving did it amazingly. I would recommend this book if you haven't read it. I would definitely say this opened my eyes to something that I hadn't spent half enough time considering before. Then we move on to the non-fictions. I'll try and talk about these in the order that I read them. So firstly we have Caitlin Moran's How to Be a Woman. This was probably the first book that I read about feminism, as I think a lot of people could say, and it's a funny one because my feelings for Caitlin Moran have kind of gone a bit awry recently. I went to see her live, I really enjoyed that, and I did really like her, but I've kind of lost a bit of respect for her because I think she does have a habit of talking about things that she doesn't necessarily know about, and she also has a habit of approaching feminism from a very privileged standpoint in a way. She very much has her own kind of idealised version of what feminism should be, which I think works for people who are first going on the path to feminism. There are things in here that, looking back, I don't actually agree with. However, when I first read this, it was eye-opening. Basically, this follows Caitlin Moran as she is coming to terms with the fact that she is a feminist, and it looks at not just feminism issues, but it looks at what it's like growing up female. It talks about some taboo subjects such as masturbation and obviously menstruation, and it just does so in a very witty and funny way, as you can imagine from Caitlin Moran. I think it's accessible because it's funny, and it's not too heavy on feminism. I think, as I say, as an endpoint, it's definitely worth a read. And you know, this book very much started me on my journey of seeking out feminist texts, and I have a lot to thank it for, so if you haven't read this, I would recommend doing so. Then I've got Nothing to Envy by Barbara Demick. This is a book that talks about North Korea, and I think it's always an interesting subject because so little is known about North Korea, and there is so little literature out there about the subject. Basically, Barbara Demick in this, it's a very interesting non-fiction in the fact that she is speaking to people who have defected from North Korea, and through speaking to them, she kind of creates this complete history of the country. And we constantly come back to these characters and what they're doing at what time. But I think for the very nature that it is a book about North Korea, and it talks about things that you don't necessarily hear about in the media, I think it was a really interesting book, and it was really eye-opening. And one of the things that has really stuck with me is a part at the end where Barbara Demick asks all the people who have defected if they would return to North Korea, and pretty much every single one of them unanimously said that they wished that they could go back, and that they would go back, and they did intend to go back at some point in the future. Obviously, it's horrendous, you know, some horrible things happen, and it talks about starvation in the country and the issues of poverty and inequality, but it's not just a tirade against North Korea, it's a realistic portrayal of the country through the eyes of people who have been there, and it really is an eye-opener for anyone who doesn't know that much about the subject of North Korea. Then I have got Girls Will Be Girls by Emma O'Toole. This is quite a recent read for me. I read this in the second half of last year, and it was actually one of my favourite books of the year. This is such a fantastic book, and what made it better for me is the fact that I didn't even know what it was about really going into it. This is about gender and what it means to be a woman, and what it means to question what it means to be a woman, if that makes sense. Through Emma O'Toole's research and also her own experience of growing body hair and playing around with her own image, you get a fantastic look at gender and gender stereotypes and the way that we approach our own genders. I think this is fascinating. Obviously there are a lot of books about gender out there at the moment. It's kind of the big thing, but I would say that this one's well worth a read because it makes you think about your own gender. I think a lot of books on the market kind of treat gender as a separate issue. Certainly for me, until I read this, I had never read anything that made me think about my gender and the way that I conform without even realising. That's very much what Emma O'Toole looks at, you know, and there's a section where she is at a family dinner and the meal finishes and she's the only woman there, and instantly the men assume that she's going to do the cleaning, and Emma herself sort of goes to do it and then thinks, well, hang on a minute, you know, why is the woman automatically, and she just continually questions these things that we consider normal. Since I have definitely questioned every presumption that I have made from my gender, and I think this book will also change the way that I raise children if I have any, because there is a section that talks about the way that we gender stereotype our children, and since reading this I've actually heard so many people say really stereotypical gender things about their children. For instance, people who have boys saying, oh, don't pick up that makeup, that's for girls, sort of thing, which is a comment that I probably wouldn't have picked up on, but having read this book, it really is a sticking point with me now, so I would highly recommend this. And last but not least, we have Quiet by Susan Cain. It looks like a white cover, but it has got glossy writing on it. So I wasn't sure whether to add this one in here because I don't think it necessarily taught me anything that I didn't already know. But having it written down and kind of backed up with research and things like that really did open my eyes, I think, and it's a book that I keep referring back to in just my general life, so I think it needed a mention here. This is all about what it's like to be a quiet person in a world kind of champions extroverts. Susan Cain is American, so obviously she lives in a society that is much more geared towards extroversion than here in the UK, but even here, a lot of the time in workplaces and things like that, and just general the way people treat each other, extroversion is kind of the norm, and to be quiet or to sit in the back is seen as not normal and that you're not enjoying yourself. Susan Cain just questions that and says that actually some of the most influential people in the world have been quiet people, and she also looks at the research behind the power of being quiet and the fact that, for instance, companies who use an open plan office are actually doing more damage potentially to the creativity that their employees show. It's really interesting, and I think it's an eye-opener for both quiet people and extroverted people, because I think it helps quiet people understand themselves more, and I think it would also really help extroverts to understand the way that they treat the quieter people in their lives. So those are all of my eye-opening books. Please let me know down below what books have opened your eyes in the past, and I will be sure to check them out, and I will see you next time. Bye!